Every inhabited continent carries her African footprint somewhere in its bloodline. We uncover the women history left behind. Her story, our history, our legacy. This is Roots Unspoken.
Last episode ended on this man and on a promise that the reason we know any of this, the queens, the offices, the arguments, runs through the griots. I need to take part of that back, not the good part. The griots are real, they're extraordinary, and everything I implied about the sophistication of what they do is true and then some. The problem is the word the. The griots, like there's one of them, like it's a category, the way librarian is a category, like the man you're looking at right now is a representative of something continental. He isn't. He's a specialist from a specific place, and his expertise has borders the way real expertise always does, because Idia was Edo, Yaa Asantewaa was Akan. And a griot never sang a word about either of them. 4 more institutions kept those women. Only one of them is a man with an instrument. One of them isn't a person at all. Here's the move I nearly made, and it's the same one this channel exists to argue against. Griot is a French word. The people it describes call themselves Jeli in Mande languages in the Mande world. Mali, Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea. That's a real place with real borders. It is not a continent, but griot travels. It's the one African word for this that English speakers know, so it gets stretched over everything, every memory keeper, every court historian, every archive from Dakar to the Congo. And the moment you stretch it that far, you've said something false about almost everyone it now covers. Watch how fast it breaks. Idia was Edo, Benin City in what's now southern Nigeria. Yaa Asantewaa was Akan, Kumasi in Ghana. The women of the last episode's dual-sex systems were Igbo. The Alaafin's court was Yoruba. Nzinga was Mbundu in Angola, more than 3,000 kilometers from the nearest Jeli. Not one of these people is a Mande. Not one of their histories passed through a griot's hands. So either those women simply weren't remembered, which is absurd because we're talking about them right now, 6 centuries later, or every one of those societies had its own institution for not forgetting. Its own answer to the same problem. They did. There are at least 5 of them in this pillar alone, and they are not variations on a theme. They're 5 different technologies. One of them isn't oral at all. 2 of them are held by women, which in an episode about how women's history survived turns out not to be a detail. Flattening all 5 into griots is the same mistake as flattening a continent into they liked queens. It's flattering, it's warm, it's wrong. So 5 systems. Here's the first one, and it's the one you were promised. A Jeli is not a storyteller. A storyteller is someone with a story. A Jeli is a professional with a job description, and the job is inherited. You're born into a Jeli family. Training starts in early childhood and runs for years before anyone lets you recite a ruling family's genealogy in public, because if you get it wrong in public, you haven't made a mistake, you've made a succession crisis. Someone's claim to land or a throne runs through the line you just fumbled. The tradition's institutional roots run to the Mali Empire, formalizing as the Mande world built larger and more complicated states, roughly between 1000 and 1200 CE, and you can see exactly why it appears when it does. A big state generates paperwork whether or not it has paper. Who owns this land? Which branch of the family has the older claim? What was agreed between these 2 clans and when? Somebody has to hold that retrievably and be answerable for it. The Mande answer was, make it a profession, make it hereditary, and train the holder from the age of 5. The famous product is the Epic of Sunjata Keita, founder of the Mali Empire, a detailed narrative of 13th century West Africa carried across 700 years by recitation, which historians still work with as a source today. We'll come back to Sunjata because the honest story about that epic is more complicated than the one I just told you, and it's the hardest thing in this episode. But hold the shape of the thing for a second, a state that solved record-keeping by building people instead of buildings. The archive ate dinner, the archive had opinions. The archive could be paid, and remember that because it matters later. Now watch what happens when you cross a border. 200 kilometers east, the Yoruba of Oyo had the Arokin, oral traditionalists, historians and musicians attached to the household of the Alaafin, the king. Court historians with a desk, essentially, except the desk was the palace and the filing system was them. Their reach is not small. When Samuel Johnson, a Yoruba pastor born 1846, great-grandson of an Alaafin, compiled the history of the Yorubas, the book that shaped essentially every later account of the Yoruba past, he built it on the royal bards. They gave him an unbroken recitation of 38 Alaafins. He cross-checked their variants against each other to resolve discrepancies, which is, and I want to be precise about this, exactly what a historian does with written sources. Johnson said of the royal keepers that it is on them that we depend, as far as possible, for any reliable information we now possess. Now the complication, and it's a beautiful one. The scholar Paulo de Moraes Farias, who actually asked the Arokin about their own craft, found that they didn't describe their job the way a modern archivist would. They grounded their use of history in consolation. The purpose of recalling the past as they understood it was to steady a ruler, to explain the present, to restore equanimity against grief and anger. Sit with that. It's a memory institution that states out loud that its function is emotional, not a neutral record, a record kept for someone to do something to them, which sounds damning until you ask what a European court chronicler was for. Ghana, the Asante court. In the first place, the last episode's promise falls apart in your ears rather than on a map. The kwadwomfoɔ are the Asante bards, and the ethnomusicologist Akwasidae, who is given access to centuries-old material held at the court itself, is blunt about them. The kwadwomfoɔ do not sing. They recite poetry in a heightened speech mode. It is not song, and calling it song is not a rounding error, it's a description of a different act. They perform at dawn on Sunday to wake the Asante Edwom head of songs, wake up so he can prepare for Akwasidae. They performed in time of war. They performed while he presided over the Asante council. This is a standing verbal art system with named forms, kwadwom, the bard's poetry, and alpai, the referential poetry recited by the constabulary, and alongside it the atumpan, the talking drums which don't accompany language. They are language. And now the part that should stop you because we already met her. Last episode, describing the Ohima, the Akan female ruler, I said she was the royal genealogist. That in a matrilineal society, whoever authoritatively knows who is descended from whom holds the keys to the throne. I said it as a fact about power. It is equally a fact about memory. The sources call her the one who holds the sacred memory of the clan's ancestors, the only person who can indisputably trace the royal line. Her veto over kings is an archival function. She can stop a man becoming king because she is the one who knows. The Akan memory institution isn't only the men reciting at dawn, it's her. I introduced her an episode ago and walked straight past what she was. And now the system that breaks the premise entirely, the one that isn't oral, isn't song, and isn't paper either. Benin, Idia's Benin, the Edo answer to how do we not forget was to cast the record in metal and bolt it to the palace. The Igun Eronmwon, the Royal Brasscasters Guild, still on Igun Street in Benin City today, produced somewhere north of 900 brass plaques, cast roughly between 1500 and the mid-1600s. The technique is sirperedu, lost wax casting, done to a standard of precision the guild guarded jealously because it was theirs. In the 17th century, a Dutch writer, Alfred Dapper, described the palace galleries, long square galleries resting on wooden pillars from top to bottom covered with cast copper on which are engraved the pictures of their war exploits and battles. Read that again slowly. The war record was on the pillars, the building was the document. You did not need a trained specialist to retrieve it, and you did not need to be able to read. You needed eyes and permission to walk in. Think about what that does to access. Every other system in this episode has a gatekeeper, a person you have to ask, who has to agree to recite, who might want paying. Benin's record had no gatekeeper standing between you and it. It was just there at eye level in the corridor all day whether or not anyone felt like performing it, and it was durable in a way a person is not. A Jeli dies and takes his training with him unless he passed it on in time. Brass doesn't forget. Brass doesn't embellish for a patron. Brass doesn't die in a bad year and leave a hole in the succession. That is a genuinely different technology from everything else in this episode. The Jeli solves memory with a person, the Arokin solve it with a household, the kwadwomfoɔ solve it with a calendar, Benin solved it with architecture and by doing so made the record permanent, public, and completely immovable, which turned out to be the one weakness that mattered. A Jeli can walk away from an invasion. He takes the archive with him because he is it. A building can't run. Here's where I have to be careful because the vivid version of this story is false and I nearly told it to you. The vivid version, Britain tore the plaques off the palace walls in 1897, it's a great sentence, it isn't what happened. In 1702, another Dutch visitor, David van Injendal, gave a detailed account of the same palace, gallery after gallery, an altar with 11 cast copper heads and an elephant tusk on top. What he doesn't do is mention the plaques on the pillars, and from that silence, scholars infer they'd already come down. I want to flag exactly how thin that floor is. That's an argument from silence. One visitor not mentioning something is not the same as reporting its absence, and some readings of his account suggest he did see figural reliefs. The honest sentence is, at some point between Dapper and Van Injendal, the plaques probably left the pillars and we don't know why. Because when the British punitive expedition reached Benin City in 1897, they did not find the plaques on the walls. They found more than 900 of them stacked in a storage room inside the palace. Nobody knows who put them there or when or why. What we can say is that they were in that room long before Britain was, and that Britain looted the room, not the wall. The best reading of the evidence is that Benin shelved its own archive, somewhere in that 200-year gap, for reasons that are lost. The British Museum holds the largest single group of what came out of that room. Germany, France, the Netherlands, and the United States took significant shares. In 2022, Germany transferred ownership of over 1,100 objects back to Nigeria, so look at what this does to the sentence her story vanished from paper. Idia's Benin didn't lose its record. Benin's record survived being shelved for 200 years. What it did not survive was being taken. The history of Benin isn't hard to consult because nobody wrote it down. It's hard to consult because it's in London. The fifth system is the one that looks like an absence until you notice what it's missing. Igbo society had no griot equivalent, no hereditary bardic caste, and once you've watched the other four, the reason is obvious. The Jeli, the Arokin, the kwadwomfoɔ, and the Igun Eronmwon all have one thing in common. They all work for a king. Centralized states produce professional memory keepers because a centralized state has one throne worth arguing over and can afford to pay someone to know. Much of Igboland didn't have that throne, and a society without a court doesn't stop remembering, it distributes the job. So Igbo history lives in shrines, genealogies, naming practices, masquerade poetry, proverbs. The researchers describe it as a living archive, history that isn't stored so much as ritually enacted, spatially grounded, and socially authorized. The record isn't in a room, it's in a place you stand, an act you perform, and a name you give a child, a name that is frequently a sentence about what was happening the year they were born. Note the gendering because it's specific. Male elders typically officiate at public shrines, while women manage domestic and maternal altars tied to fertility, lineage, and childbirth. Those are described as mnemonic repositories in their own right, where objects, songs, and taboos encode history running down the maternal line. Which brings us to the claim this episode wanted most, and the one I have to be most careful with. This channel doesn't do heroes with the hard parts cut out, and this episode has 3 hard parts. They're all in the system I've been most flattering about. 1. Sunjata exists in many versions and they disagree. There's no definitive text, there are dozens of published recorded versions, and the scholarship on their differences is an entire field. Oral transmission isn't a photocopier. It's interpretation, adaptation, performance for this audience on this night. David Conrad, who has spent a career on this material, notes the epic is so full of shared motifs that you start to wonder what's historical at all, and concedes that without independent documentation confirming Sunjata existed, he'd be inclined to doubt the man himself, and would treat anything the tradition says about his life with extreme suspicion. Which flips the point I was going to make. I was going to tell you that Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan traveler who spent months at the Mali court in the 1350s and who met and named an actual Griot, Iduga, corroborates the oral tradition. Cleaner story, but the arrow points the other way. The written account is what lets historians anchor the oral one. That's not a defeat for oral tradition, it's just what source criticism looks like, and it cuts in both directions. 2. The archive could be paid. A Jeli asked for money and gifts in exchange for praise. That has always drawn the charge of opportunism, and critics argue commercial pressure erodes impartiality, that a performer will reach for the mythic, marketable episode over the verifiable genealogy, because that's what feeds him. A praise singer paid by the person being praised is not a neutral archive. That was as true in the 13th century as it is on a record label now. 3. And this is the one that guts the title Ep 14 promised you. Female griots, Ijeli Muso, are born into the same lineages, trained from the same age, and they are extraordinary, but in performance the labor splits. The men narrate the historical framework and deliver the formal genealogical recitation. The women sing the praise songs, so Queen survived in song. The women sang, the men kept the record. If this episode had shipped under the title it was promised, it would have handed you a compliment instead of a fact. So was remembering a woman's job? I wanted the answer to be yes. Here's the honest version. The Ohima, yes, and it's solid. Multiple serious sources, including the Oxford Research Encyclopedia, name her the royal genealogist, the one who can indisputably trace the line. An Akan king's legitimacy ran through a woman's memory. That's not a stretch, that's the job. The Umuada, the lineage daughters, not proven, and I'm not going to pretend, that they're custodians of tradition and mediators of disputes is well attested. But the specific claim I wanted, the Umuada as a mode of historical production, a memory institution, traces to one recent paper in a journal I can't vouch for. One source is not a finding, it's a lead. 1 of 5, firmly, maybe 2, I'd rather hand you the smaller number, but hold on to the one that's solid because it's enough on its own. In the Akan system, the question, who is the rightful king, was answered by asking a woman what she remembered. Her memory wasn't a supplement to the record, it was the record and it outranked every man in the room. That's not remembering as a courtesy, that's remembering as an office with a veto attached. Africa did not have one memory, it had a person, a household, a calendar, a building, and a shrine. 5 different answers to the same question, none of them a version of the others. These women aren't missing from history. They're exactly where their own societies decided to keep them, and those societies decided differently because they were different societies. That's the whole argument, not that Africa remembered beautifully, that Africa remembered specifically. The paper trail didn't fail these women. In Benin, the paper trail is 900 plaques deep. It's just not in Benin. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. On the next episode, we go underground to the digs still open right now, pulling up the throne rooms, the walls, and the palace floors that decide which of these stories was true all along.